Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Stevie Garofalo. This is Reason for Truth. You know, where the truth comes first, the reasons come last, but we're always and constantly learning, because when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. A good article came on the, some people say the cerveza sickness, like that's what they call it. Call it about COVID. Anyways, titles was by Katrina Trinko, put out by Christian Broadcast Network. It's really good on April 6, 2023. I'm going to give you a little bit cross-section because I think it's interesting. It says how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the church attendance and habits. I don't want to focus on COVID-19. Just want to focus strictly on how that affected church attendance. She did a great job. I'll make a little comment, but I want to go through this article she wrote on April 6, 2023. You could follow her, by the way, on Twitter, twitter.com at Katrina, Katrina, Trinko, Trinko. Okay? This was published again April 6, 2023. And she writes this: 1 out of every 5 Americans say they attend religious services less frequently after the COVID-19 pandemic. But Trinko opens her article by asking, will the churches be full this Easter? Okay, speaking here 2023. Or did the COVID-19 pandemic and the long time of closed churches usher in a new era? Now, the data doesn't suggest churches to be bursting at the seams, but 20% of Americans say that they attend religious services less frequently after the pandemic, while 7% say they attend more often. So some people, it's interesting, that statistic's greater than I thought, but it shows you some people get the memo. Hey, this is serious stuff here, right? World is changing. So 7% got it. They go to church more, while 20% go less. But it's interesting. This is all according to a Pew Research Center poll conducted in November of, 2022, I'm assuming. Among Christians, 25% attend less frequently now, including 35% of Black Protestants and 27% of Hispanic Catholics. Among Jews, 18% attend less frequently. A January study paints a similar dismal picture. The number of Americans who say they regularly or occasionally attend church is at 32%, down from 36%, according to the Survey Center and American Life, a project of the American Enterprise Institute. In that same time period, the percentage of Americans who never attend religious services rose to 33%, up from 25%. So there you go. Got some good news. And while you can certainly pray outside of the church, praying in a community is generally a crucial component, she writes, unless you're an extraordinary holy hermit. There's no lone rangers in the church. It doesn't work that way. Praying with others brings about community and accountability. And that's important. Without community, you're not going to grow in your faith. And without accountability, if you think that you're that strong, I'd say you're wrong. Okay? You're always wrong if you think you're that strong. How about that new saying? And I like what Matthew says, 18:20 says, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. That's what Jesus said. Okay, his own words. Trinko goes on to say that, but I also cherish going to church these days because I remember so vividly the sadness of Easter 2020. She said, my church, like so many others across the country, was closed. There would be no Easter Mass that year. Trinko went on to say, but the church with just a handful of people there when she went in was utterly quiet, felt desolate. It felt empty, and it didn't feel joyous. The tomb is empty kind of way, she said. Tomb is empty is not a sad thing. I think it's a good thing. That's what we want. And listen, sadness is not a bad thing. Sadness brings us back to reality. We don't have to be joyful. We don't have to be happy all the time. It is nice to be free, but Christianity grows in difficult times, and I've said it 1,000 times. I'll say it again. My teacher and mentor of 19 years, Dr. Norman Geis, used to say, Christians are like tea. The best flavors come out when the water is the hottest. And I would say that that's the way it is. You look at the church in China, they have more Christians now than we have population in the United States. Now, granted, their country's huge with over 1 billion people, but certainly the church in Iran is growing, in Iraq rapidly. So while I certainly don't envy pastors and the choices they had to make and face at the beginning of the pandemic, especially given the terror of the super spreader events and the lack of knowledge, she writes, regarding treating COVID-19. And then she says, I would have if the numbers had declined so much, if the churches had responded differently, she wonders. in the pandemic, if there had been a more extensive attempt to hold religious services, even if they had needed to be outside and even if they needed to have fewer people. Now, I know of churches, folks, certainly down here in the South, and I know of one in the D.C. area, who did a great job at that. Like they did a thing like a drive-in movie theater. And they held it outside. So it's up to you. I think where churches get so staunch in the way church is done mechanically, that's when you know the church is more mechanical, I guess, more tradition-based than it is. You think about the original church. I don't think they had any super speakers or, large buildings where people gathered by the thousands or even the hundreds, small home churches. So we had to get a little sober about the reality of if we want it, we can do it. No one can ever squelch the church. Never. It happens in countries that are close to the Christian faith and the gospel. We can do it here. And then Trinko goes on to ask the most important question, I think, of the whole article, which is this. After all, if you don't turn to God during a pandemic, when do you turn to him? Great question. Great question. Skipping down a bit. Well, let me just pause here for a minute. You're right. We had 9/11. We had the crash of 2008, 2009, economics. Going back to the 70s, the gas shortage, interest rates then. You think they're bad now? They went up to over 20%. There's always challenges in this world, okay? And so if you don't turn to God this month, you really should next month. Shootings, in Christian schools in Tennessee and all over the country. When do you turn to God? When do you think that you can do it on your own? That's the depravity of man and woman that leads to a road that just goes deeper into the darkness. Anyways, that is a whole nother episode, so I'm going to avoid that rabbit trail. But I'm going to leave that little bit in. Skipping down a bit, Trinko goes on to say, but now we're left to pick up the pieces to see how not just the pandemic, but how we respond to the pandemic how it changed not only the church, but our culture and our society. And there are some hopeful signs. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, she writes, he's a signed, and he's a Republican, signed last month a bill that bans treating churches differently from businesses during medical emergencies. But there's much more repair, she writes, and building is not a policy matter. Okay, I would pause and say, I think the church just needs to pivot on a dime. The problem is we have so many mechanisms and physical locations and a lot of affluence and a lot of wealth built up in the churches, and I think that's what slows it down. But I do think that churches have to look at the mission more than the wealth or the building or anything else. It's the people. That's the church, not the building. So although given how crucial religiosity and the values are to the American experiment we call the United States, there will certainly be policy implications if religiosity declines. And it's like a matter of asking friends and family to join us in the church and talking to others about why it's important for us to be in church on Sunday. There's an old African-American spiritual, I guess it's like a hymn or a saying that Trinko said she heard in church on Palm Sunday. And it goes like this: were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Saying twice. Then it goes on to say, oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Now, she says this, but the last verse pivots to the resurrection. It says this: were you there when God raised him from the tomb? Were you there when God raised him from the tomb? And then it goes on to say, oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when God raised him from the tomb? Now, the closest thing we have to being there, what happened more than 2,000 years ago, is to be in the church. And when I say that, I'm not talking about a physical building, but the body of Christ. And we can do that in the building of the church. So I look at Easter as something we ought not observe once a year, but all year round. We could pray that God would intervene and he would fill our hearts and fill our churches, the body of Christ. Raise up the body of Christ, the churches will emerge. Now, listen, they will rise. What we don't want to do is rise the churches and the people will come. We want to make the people come and then the churches rise. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what Katrina Trinko is talking about. Now, listen, I hope you gathered something good for this Easter season, which I think is every day, every week, every minute of our day. You can follow, again, Katrina Trinko, again, at twitter.com @Katrina Trinko, as I said in the opening. In closing, I want to encourage you to get back to seriously attending physical church and get off the online church, because it's the only in the physical sense that the true church is going to flourish and be found. And it's the only way your faith is going to grow, and it's going to stay solid. And it's the only place you're going to find joy and fellowship. People are depressed today. Well, get out. Go be with people. You forget about all that stuff. Have fun. Have a coffee. Grab a sandwich. Until sandwiches become like $940 with inflation. Whatever. Then you make a tuna fish sandwich. Think we'll always be able to afford something, peanut butter. The church is not a building, but a physical gathering of believers. This is impossible to experience virtually. And fellowship cannot be obtained virtually. And accountability cannot be gained virtually. Find a good imperfect church. And if you find that perfect church, remember, once you step foot in that church has then become imperfect. Same is true for me, ladies and gentlemen, regarding that. The great news is that Jesus Christ is alive. He's on the throne, and he's waiting for you and I. He's waiting for the church, his bride, the church, to get back to being the church, whether that's in the church building, that's in a structure somewhere else, is that a movie theater, whether that's even in a park. I know listen, it could be anywhere, your backyard, on a patio. It's where the body gathers. It doesn't need to be in a formal building. So let's get back to meeting in person as the body of Christ and let the pandemic be behind us. Thank you for tuning in for today's episode. Make sure you join my community. Where is that? StephenGarofalo.com. It's free. If you want the episodes of the podcast early, you can get them on audio there 1 to 3 days early under the subscriber level. And if you want some cool online training, you want to check out EquippedAcademy.com. You can do that anywhere in the world. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. It is Zero for Truth for today.